This is Anon. Sorry I don't have a real picture. We don't know much about him. I couldn't tell you his name or where he lives or any other details like that. What I can tell you is that he is in love with this girl. This is someone special. This is someone that Anon has grown up with. Someone that Anon regularly has sleepovers with. There's a special connection here. And sure, things are a little bit off on her end, but nothing is ever as perfect as the movies make it out to be. And besides, she still wants him. Badly. On its own, this feels like a complete story. Boy meets girl, boy likes girl, they fall in love, happy ending. But that's not what this is. Life is never that simple. The two hang out with their friends Eric and Dave. It's ordinary high school stuff. Video games, drugs, not being cool enough for parties, you know the drill. And then a new friend comes along. The guys start hanging around with Eric's cousin. There's beer, food, Halo, and most of all, a good time. It's a bit weird that a 37-year-old is hanging around with high schoolers, but who cares? They're just having fun. What's the harm in that? Anon starts bringing the girl, and hey, look, he knows to stay away. Totally not creepy at all. Turning to a lighter subject, drinking games. Those are always fun. And we've got house rules for added flavor. Okay, that's a little bit misogynistic, but if she's okay with it, I guess it's fine. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can see it happening. I can see Anon putting on a mask of indifference while his eyes are blinded by rage. He can't think straight. Everyone else is just mopping the floor with this poor soul. After every game, he watches her, silently begging her to come back to him. But she doesn't care. I lied to you earlier. This is not an isolated incident. This has been building up from the very beginning. This is the culmination of the cousin's perversions, the girl's meekness, and Anon's inability to stop any of it. This isn't so bad. These are Anon's friends. Friends don't hurt friends, right? Okay, sure, they have her sit on their laps normally, but they're still his friends. They wouldn't hurt him like this. And besides, these two people have known each other their entire lives. It's gonna take a heck of a lot more than some lap sitting to break the bond they have. I know, things look kind of bad, but come on. She really likes him. A lot. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Hey, I know it's kind of weird to mention it amidst all this other stuff, but Anon's uncle is getting married. The wedding is happening the same day as one of these hangs. Anon spends 11 lines of text being scared because she'll be there and he won't, but oh, come on, it'll be fine. The girl apologizes, the guys apologize, and now, finally, it's over. After all the pain in the world, it's finally over. We can finally celebrate the end of the— Wait. What was that at the end there? Oh no. Oh no. Oh please, God, no. Well, okay, look, she says friendship, right? That's all that's happening here. It's a revival of a friendship gone sour. That's all it is. And Anon's getting a bit paranoid and stealing his parents' booze to make the group stay at his place, but it's really not a huge deal. At the end of the day, this will work itself out. Right? Anon has been grounded. He can't see his friends. She can't sleep over. They're probably gonna hang out without him. Anon is, of course, panicking, but come on. Nothing's gonna happen. She said friendship earlier. Anon's just being dramatic. Everything will be perfectly fine. I read this post for the first time months before making this video. It was 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I was lying in my bed depressed because my ex had dumped me a few days before. This line was the point where I lost hope. I recreated my initial feelings in this video. I may have cut out most of the original post, but the optimism was there for me. I guess I kind of assumed it would end happily. I assumed that the perpetually online shut-in writing this would give his hero a wife and children, and they would all forget about those early lapses in judgment. This line was the moment where I was confronted with reality, where I realized that this story is probably real. It was probably written by a real-life human being with real-life human problems. That's the thing we often forget about the internet. We tend to assume that a guy online is some fat loser who smells like Cheeto dust and never moved out of his parents' basement. We forget that these people are human beings. People who dream and hope and love and lose. People who have lived lives like the rest of us, even if they are a bit shut in.
It's all over but the crying, and nobody's crying but me. Friends all over know I'm trying to forget about how much I care for you. It's all over but the dreaming. Poor little dreams that keep trying to come true. It's all over but the crying, and I can't get over crying over you. It's all over but the crying, and nobody's crying but me. Friends all over know I'm trying to forget about how much I care for you. It's all over but the dreaming. Poor little dreams that keep trying to come true. It's all over